Well, you try to reduce the turbulence. Now, there is a way to do that through the United Nations. That's in accord with world order and international law and our treaty obligations. But the U.S. completely refuses that. The U.S. has been strongly opposed to the international community, to international law, to the United Nations, to the World Court for at least 30 years. I mean, you can tell that just by looking at vetoes of Security Council resolutions. The U.S. is way in the lead since the 60s. Britain is second. France is a distant third. Russia's fourth. China doesn't exist.
Okay.
And the same is true of the World Court. The U.S. doesn't want to allow them to be there. Well, okay, then what do? If we can't allow the international community to get involved, you shift over to NATO. There, at least, the U.S. dominates it. So the thing shifts to NATO. Well, within NATO, there's also a disagreement. The United States and Britain are essentially warrior states. They have an overwhelming monopoly of force. So they quite naturally turn to the use of force as the obvious way to deal with anything.
But could a Cold War institution like NATO be converted to, either humanitarian or any other diplomatic purposes?
I mean, it's not a logical impossibility, but it would be something novel in history.
No. Okay, let me try to take a few more phone calls because our lines are really ringing off the hook. Good afternoon, you're on the air. Please be brief.
Yes, I keep seeing people equating this with the Holocaust, and I think the ghost of the Holocaust is making a lot of people irrational and unable to see the dissimilarities and unable to think clearly. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Okay, thanks for your call.
Right. You're quite right. It is being compared with the Holocaust, and that is an insult, a horrendous insult to the victims of Hitler. I mean, if this is a Holocaust, then there have been thousands of Holocausts since 1945, beginning, for example, with what happened in Palestine in 1947 and 48, and other events much worse at the same time. I remember quoting the leading Israeli newspaper on that. They can see it. What was happening up until the bombing is a humanitarian crisis of a kind that exists all over the world, unfortunately, and we're often involved in them. What is going on right now after the NATO bombing is beginning to approach other cases, like, say, the Palestinians in 47 and 48. It's not even close yet to what's happening in Turkey right in the 1990s. It's nothing like what's going on in Africa. Why is the term Holocaust being used by people who we ought to call Holocaust revisionists? I mean, people who are denying the reality of the Holocaust. Why are those people now using it to refer to what's going on there? Well, as a justification for the violence of the state. That's all.
Okay, let me try to take a few more calls. Good afternoon, you're on the air. Please be brief.
Good afternoon. I was hoping to ask Dr. Chomsky, how do people effectively challenge this global corporate media disinformation complex? It's obviously got a stranglehold on information. How do we effectively challenge that and win? Thank you.
Thanks for the call.
I wish there were a simple answer to that, but the answer is by education, educating oneself and others, organization, pressures, alternative media, pressures on the existing media. Mainly it's a matter of breaking through the stranglehold of propaganda. And that's something that's very hard to do on your own. If you're sitting alone, looking at the television set, it's extremely hard not to think independently. With others, it's quite possible. That's what organizations are for. There are many ways of doing this. For example, there are internet forums, for example, ZNet forum, for example, which is full of debate and discussion, thousands of people contributing on these issues. And okay, there you can interchange ideas and get an understanding.
Mm-hmm. I will ask you, Professor Chomsky, towards the end of the program to tell to our listeners maybe a few sites, and I have also a few websites that I will recommend. But let me try to take a few more calls. Good afternoon, you're on the air.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Yesterday on CNN, I heard a professor of international studies suggest that this is one of those places where Christianity and Islam come up against each other. I wonder if this could be part of a larger picture. What's your views on that?
It sounds
Thanks
like
for the
Samuel
call.
Huntington of Harvard, who's been peddling that idea for some years. I think it's complete nonsense. I mean, if you look at the interactions of Christianity and Islam, they go in every possible direction. The most fundamentalist Islamic state in the world, namely Saudi Arabia, happens to be a close U.S. ally. In in the 1980s. The United States was fighting a virtual war with the Catholic Church in Central America. That's why the decade began with an archbishop being murdered and ended with 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals being murdered by military forces that we were supporting. I mean, in fact, there are lots and lots of complications around the world, but Islam versus Christianity is a very minor element.
Okay, let me try to include a few more calls here. Good afternoon, you're on the air.
Hello, Mr. Chomsky,
Yeah.
Professor. Wow, I'm thrilled to even be able to talk indirectly to you here, sir.
Yeah.
I'll make this quick. Did we win World War II as a nation, or was there some kind of German corporation or something that did? I'll take it. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for the call.
That's a very interesting and very complicated question, much too much for a simple answer. But the fact of the matter is that the war in Europe, so the war against Hitler, was overwhelmingly fought by the Russians. The overwhelming majority of Hitler's forces were on the Eastern Front. The U.S. and Britain were mostly fighting elsewhere. At the end of the war, the region was essentially partitioned, pretty much where the armies were. And the U.S. then returned to what had been its position in the 1930s, the U.S. and Britain, namely supporting the traditional structures, which were mostly pro-fascist, and suppressing the resistance, the anti-fascist resistance. I mean, that's why people like Klaus Barbie, to take a famous case, shifted directly from working for the Nazis to working for the U.S. occupying forces. Perhaps the most dramatic example was Reinhard Gehlen, a leading Nazi war criminal, who was the head of military intelligence and operations on the Eastern Front. Anybody who knows the history knows what that means. Well, he was immediately picked up by the U.S. CIA, made the head of U.S. operations in the East. The same thing happened in Japan, I should say. So, for example, Japan had a horrifying biological warfare program run by doctors who were the perfect equivalent of Mengele, trying it out on human subjects and so on. They were taken over by the United States. They were immunized so that they were protected from any war crimes trials. When the Russians tried to try some of them for war crimes, that was ridiculed here as communist show trials. They were taken to the United States, and they formed the basis of the U.S. Bacteriological and biological warfare program.
Okay.
And so who won? Well, let me quote a leading Central American Democrat, Arevalo, who was the first Democratic leader in Guatemala. He wrote a book around the mid-1950s in which he said, unfortunately, Roosevelt lost the war and Hitler won it, judging by what was going on in Central America.
So pretty much old story. Let me try to take a few more phone calls. Good afternoon, you're on the air. Please be brief.
Hi, it's a pleasure to talk to you, Dr. Chomsky. I'd like to get back to what you were talking about the rich and powerful aspect of this in terms of who's in control. If you could maybe break that down and help us understand how to follow the money here, I think it might help people clarify in their minds about what's really going on. Thank you.
Thanks for your call.
Well, there isn't much disagreement about where power lies. There are 7 rich countries, G7 they're called. Those are overwhelmingly dominated internally, including the United States, by corporate and financial sector. So there's a highly concentrated corporate sector by now, a lot of it multinational, international financial sectors, small groupings of them with tight connections internationally, and they form the sort of corporate, the corporate banking, financial, private power sector, which is closely integrated with governments. The rich governments relies on them and largely dominates them. And then they have their international institutions, like the IMF, for example.
Right, and that was actually
work for them. And that's it's not like the Communist Party with a leadership, but it's a pretty closely interconnected array of highly concentrated power centers.
Let me try to include.
Which
I know that
includes the media. They're just part of the corporate sector.
I know that so many people would like to at least briefly be with you, Professor Chomsky, so I'll try to include a few more listeners. Good afternoon, you're on the air.
Thank you. I would just like to address the question about how to fight, not fight, but address propaganda and its effect on our brains. And from my experience, I think the school system causes a separation between right brain and left brain thinking. And a way to fight that propaganda is to do integrative thinking with analytical and creative combinations. And I was wondering if you could address that.
Thank you for the call.
Yeah, you could be right. I mean, I think a lot of the problems begin very early in the school system. I mean, my own guess is that they come from other sources, but not much is understood about these things, and I think what you suggest could well be worth pursuing.
Okay, let me try to include some more listeners.